Hello, everyone. This is Professor McKenzie again. Today we're going to be looking at Chapter 5, which is Administrative Law. The learning objectives for this chapter, I want us to be able to understand the purpose served by federal administrative agencies. There are also state agencies, but the focus for this chapter is federal. We're going to be looking at the role, the types of agencies that exist, and how the rules that are generated, called regulations, how they are generated. And so that's going to be a big focus for this chapter. I want us to be able to understand the difference between executive branch agencies and independent agencies. We'll talk about the political control of agencies and how it's almost like a tug of war between Congress and the presidency. We'll talk about how agencies make rules, as I just mentioned, and how courts can be used to challenge administrative determinations. So that's the overall focus for Chapter 5, Administrative Law. So in the slide, you'll see a bunch of different images, and this is just a brief sampling of the literal alphabet soup, as I kind of think of it, that exists for all the different federal agencies that our government has created during our nation's history. A lot of the administrative agencies that we're going to talk about, they have been given a specific task based on how our country has become more complex during our nation's history. So a lot of the agencies that you see here kind of had their creation or origin moment in the early 20th century, and in particular the 1920s and 30s. So especially after the stock market crash and during the Great Depression, that's when a lot of these agencies did pop up. And then as we've developed a more sophisticated and more modern economy, obviously we've added to those original creations. If we were looking at the 19th century, so like the 1800s, there really was not much of a need for agencies to begin with, because life was much simpler. Most people lived on farms. We didn't have modern, transportation networks. We didn't have air travel. We didn't have, people living in urban and suburban centers. People were fairly dispersed, again, living on farms. And, they pretty much took care of most of their own problems. And so there wasn't a need for the FAA or the FCC or the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, those different types of agencies that exist. The purpose of administrative agencies is to generally carry out policies that have been enacted by Congress and then signed into law by the presidency. So to give you a great example of an administrative agency, think of the EPA. There is a federal EPA as well as state EPAs. The EPA stands for the Environmental Protection Agency. And so we have tasked the EPA over the past several decades with a variety of pro-environmental, kind of like policies that we want it to pursue. So think of like the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Soil Act. Those were major pieces of federal legislation that were drafted back in the 1970s. And Congress back then, like Congress today, generally they're not scientists. And so, if you were to ask a member of Congress, how do we keep our air clean or our water clean? They really don't have any specific idea. They may speak in generalities, which is fine, but the reality is that how we work with businesses who emit different pollutants, whether it be in the air, in the soil, or in our waterways, you have to have a team of scientists and technicians that understand the technologies that exist and the methods for maintaining a cleaner environment. So when we have like the federal EPA, their employees, which are federal employees, they're scientists. That's who gets hired for the most part. So these are chemists, these are biologists, there's microbiologists, they're technicians, and they understand, what businesses are kind of emitting into our environment. And they also understand from the science, perspective, how we can minimize some of the dangers that some of those emissions can potentially cause for life and for our environment in general. So, Congress is great at big picture. I think of Congress as like a jumbo jetliner flying at 30,000 feet. Congress can kind of see the lay of the land on a macro level. It's the members of these agencies or members of the bureaucracy that, they're like the foot soldiers that are in the trenches on the ground. And so they understand what's happening in real time. And so they serve a very vital and important function in our society. To give you one more example of an agency that, again, is invaluable in terms of the services that it provides, the SEC, that's the Securities and Exchange Commission. If it involves anything pertaining to, let's say, publicly traded companies and shares of stock, they are all over that. So they monitor transactions. They want to make sure that no one is engaging in insider trading. They want to maintain the confidence of the investing public, so that you and I, if we decide that we want to purchase shares of stock in a company, that the balance sheet information, the annual reportings that are required, income statements, balance sheets, all that stuff is accurate and verified. And that's part of what the SEC does. They maintain investor confidence. Imagine if we lived in a world, without the EPA or the SEC. We could, but it would be a very different world. We as consumers would rely on businesses to do the right thing, whether it be to, kind of protect the environment or to maintain investor confidence. And I think a lot of companies would do, whatever it took to kind of keep things clean and safe for the environment and protect, consumer confidence as they invest. But then you're certainly going to have examples where companies are going to cut corners, or, at worst, they're going to be very devious in terms of, they're going to try and do anything to take advantage of those if they know that there are no sanctions or no consequences. So agencies and the rules they create, which are called regulations, you can debate, if we have too much regulation or too little regulation, depending on the area of the economy that we're focusing in on. But what I don't think is a legitimate argument is to say that we need no regulation. That I think is very careless and very dangerous. If any politician were to kind of float the idea of, well, let's just do away with all these agencies. We rely, on trust in our system as consumers. That when we buy a gallon of milk, or if we buy a car, or whatever it is. That there has been regulations that companies have followed to make sure that the products and services that they offer are not going to be harmful for us. So again, that's the big picture, of what agencies do. They really serve an invaluable function in kind of maintaining and managing our complex way of life. So part of what we can do as citizens and as the major branches of government, because certainly as we discussed in a previous chapter, we talked about the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. Government can oversee what agencies do, and they do that. We generally require open records, so that's like under the Freedom of Information Act. So most of the proceedings that agencies engage in are public, so people can attend, members of the press can attend, and then they can report to general society what's happening. If there are questions about decisions that are made within an agency, Congress can call members of an agency or the leadership of an agency into Congress, into different committees or subcommittees, and basically ask them questions and say, look, why did you do ABC, these different policies or these regulations? And so we'll talk about the Federal Register. So if an agency is contemplating a new rule, there's a way in which they have to follow certain requirements. But when you think of an agency, I always think of agencies as like mini governments, because every agency has a legislative component to it, every agency has an executive component to it, and then every agency has a judicial component to it. And we'll go through each of those as we talk about the agencies in this chapter. So when we talk about agency regulations as law, so this is how an agency can act as a lawmaking body. So first, there has to be some sort of enabling act that creates the agency. So we're going to create the Environmental Protection Agency. We're going to create the Department of Homeland Security. We're going to create the Securities and Exchange Commission, whatever it is. And so at that point, an agency is created. It becomes part of what is referred to as the bureaucracy. So these are employees of government. And what they'll do is they'll hire different positions within the agency. And so, depending on what the agency is about, again, if you're the EPA, you're going to probably hire a lot of scientists. If you're the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, you're probably going to hire people that are specialists in finance and accounting. If you're going to hire people to fill the role of the Department of Homeland Security, you're probably going to hire people that have law enforcement experience and or military experience. So again, you kind of see the world in which they're operating in. It's a very kind of finite universe that they deal with. And what they'll do is, as part of the legislative function of any agency, is they'll figure out or make a determination, do we need to maybe increase or create a regulation for what we deal with? So they'll come up with an idea. They're experts or they're specialists that work within the agency, and they'll come up with, okay, I have an idea, pertaining to, let's say the environment and how we can make rivers and oceans cleaner, from pollution. So what they'll do is they'll draft, a proposed kind of regulation, and then what they do is they publish it in what's called the Federal Register. That is a federal, I don't want to say a magazine, it's like a newsletter that gets published 5 days a week. And it's online. Obviously everything's online now, or almost everything with the internet. So you can either get an in-print edition or you can see it online. And everything is kind of divided up based on the industry we're looking at. So is it environmental? Is it aviation? Is it communications? Is it law enforcement? What are we dealing with here? And you can see whatever the proposed regulation is, it's actually published. And so in the Federal Register, it'll give you details as to how you can provide commentary. And that's really one of the big things that agencies really focus in on, is the idea they've come up with as a regulation. Well, how is the marketplace perceiving this proposed regulation? We do want to get input. So anybody under the sun can provide input. You or I, as interested citizens, companies that potentially are going to be regulated under this new regulation, if it happens, academics, scientists, public policy experts, just anybody can provide input. And at some point, once all this, public comment, period has been accumulated, and this could go on for 30, 60, 90 days sometimes. At some point, what they'll do is they'll schedule public hearings, and that's part of that transparency or freedom of information. And so in the hearings, they will actually find out, well, what is the feedback for what it is we're proposing? Again, if it's the EPA, and let's say it's a measure to improve water, the conditions of water and reduce pollution in rivers, lakes, and oceans, they're not going to want to pass a regulation that everybody hates, because what you're going to have is businesses, if they really hate it, they're not going to comply with it, or they just will kind of shut down operations that might be impacted by that regulation. And you don't want to have either of those situations. You really want to have buy-in. You want to have industry say, well, okay, we see what you're saying with this regulation. We see that there's a need to keep, our waterways as clean as possible. We have future generations that we have to think about, for example. So that's part of what they're trying to do with the public comment period and with the public hearings that they hold. At some point, they have to make a decision: are we going to go ahead with this regulation or not? So, if the answer is yes, then it becomes part of what is called the Code of Federal Regulations, a CFR, and that has the effect of law. Unless it's challenged in court, or if Congress decides to kind of override it by passing some different legislation, that actually becomes law, just like a bill in Congress if it passes and the president signs it. Agencies can also, through the public comment period and through the public hearings, they may realize this is a bad idea, and so they could just scrap it. The third option is that they might come up with a new regulation that maybe is modified. So it's similar, but it's different in some maybe key aspects. And when that happens, they republish it in the Federal Register, and this process starts all over. But agencies, when they do this, they're acting as a legislative body in a sense. They're not elected members. If you work for an agency, most of the people that work for agencies are bureaucrats. They're employees. But again, they're experts. They're trained in what they do and the universe that they operate in. When we talk about the executive power of an agency, so let's say that an agency, they go through the Federal Register process, they go through the public comment period, they go through hearings, and they decide to go with a particular piece of a proposed regulation, and it actually does become regulation, and so it's part of the CFRs, the Code of Federal Regulations. Now they have to enforce it. And so there's different ways in which agencies enforce the regulations they create. One way is they actually show up, they inspect premises. So if it's the EPA and, let's say there's different types of businesses that discharge, let's say pollution in waterways, they'll show up, they'll monitor the discharge, they might take samples, they'll test it, and determine if there's compliance or not with the regulation. If there is compliance, that's great. That's what we're trying to do. If they're out of compliance, then then we're discussing, well, what's the sanction or penalty? Are they going to be fined? Are they going to shut down operations? Are they going to be given an opportunity to maybe repair and fix whatever the problem is? That would be a determination of the inspector and the agency and the violation in question. So, you can do aerial inspections, production of papers, so like business records. Usually if it's something pertaining to what they're being regulated about, normally there's no like Fourth Amendment issue regarding, searches and seizures or Fifth Amendment issues, in terms of incrimination. But if we're talking about memos or, attorney-client privilege documents, that's different, obviously. But if it's why they're being regulated, normally they have to reveal and share that information with an inspector. If a decision has been handed down, by the executive component of an agency, and whoever is on the losing end, so let's say it's a business that's being regulated, if they feel like they're being treated unfairly for some reason, they can go through, they can't go to court initially, like a traditional courtroom. What they have to do is they have to exhaust their judicial remedies within the agency. And so every agency has like administrative judges. And what they do is they process complaints, So if I'm a company and I discharge things in the water and I've been, maybe I've been issued a citation or I've been shut down my operations, whatever the punishment is, let's say I want to challenge it. I can go to, the agency and, again, through their judicial power, I can have a judge hear my side. Certainly they'll hear, the other side in terms of the inspector, who maybe levied whatever the punishment is. And they have to make a decision. They could side with me or they could side with the inspector. Even though they're all part of the agency, I mean, obviously, they're tasked to be independent and to apply, the Constitution and all the other rights that flow from it to the parties involved. Meanwhile, while all that is happening, kind of like in a traditional courtroom environment, we could reach informal settlements. There could be, a plea arrangement, not in a criminal sense, but, we could maybe come to some kind of understanding where, we'll compromise in some way. You have a lot of different options available to you in the administrative, judicial, kind of venue. At the end of the day, though, the administrative judge could enforce civil penalties, cease and desist orders. The only way you can take that case out of the agency and go into a traditional court of law is if you exhaust all of your judicial remedies within the agency. And what that means is that at some point, the agency will issue you a final determination. They'll be like, well, you had your chance for us to hear your case. You've appealed it within our agency, maybe one or two times. And at some point, they're going to issue you a letter saying this is our final decision. If you don't like what that final decision is, then you can take that letter And then that's when you can go into a traditional courtroom and go through, the normal kind of judicial proceedings where you would have a trial and you could have an appeal and, maybe have a chance to go to the U.S. Supreme Court. If you're going to go to a traditional courtroom, usually the standard that judges are looking at is, are there issues of fact or issues of law? What really is the case in controversy here? Is the agency acting beyond the scope of why it was created? That's called ultra virus. That usually is not a problem. I mean, most agencies know the boundary of their universe and they try and not go beyond that, but it can happen. I mean, humans, make mistakes. Or if you can demonstrate that, the agency action is arbitrary or capricious in some way. Maybe you're being singled out when everybody's doing something that's wrong, and you think that you're being treated unfairly for some reason. So these are all different reasons that would maybe justify your leap into the court system. But again, remember, you have to exhaust your administrative, judicial remedies first before you can exit and go to a traditional courtroom. Just a couple of problems. Sometimes I go through these in my videos. These are things that I would discuss in a traditional classroom, but this kind of flushes out some interesting kind of details when we talk about agency action. So the problem here centers on, the events that occurred in 2001 on September 11th. So a horrific attack that occurred that involved major civilian aircraft. And the FAA is a federal agency. That's the Federal Aviation Administration. After the attacks happened, our airports were shut down for just a little over a week, and that also included our ports, for shipping. And at the time, I remember, when I first started teaching, this class, I had mentioned, that we can't have ports and airports shut down for days, weeks, months. That's like, that's depression. That's, we're going backwards significantly. And then the pandemic happened, and obviously, that presented some incredibly unique challenges. But normally, absent a pandemic, we don't want to have things shut down like that. You or I may not fly, regularly or frequently, but, so much of our way of life is tied to air travel and to shipping. For all the conveniences that we enjoy in our modern society. And so, there was a lot of pressure on the FAA to kind of, get planes back in the air after 9/11, but they wanted to be as safe as possible. And so they came up with new rules, to try and improve safety on aircraft. Normally, a new rule gets put in the Federal Register and we take 30, 60, 90 days to kind of provide public commentary, and then we have hearings. But obviously, we didn't have 30, 60, 90 days back then. We had to make a decision fairly quickly. So again, the FAA hired, the people that work there are experts in aviation, and so they know everything about the world of planes. And they came up with what they thought were reasonable measures to kind of improve cockpit safety in aircraft and overall, screening of passengers as they enter into an airport. And those measures were put into place, a little after a week after the attack on 9/11. So the question is, why did the FAA not need to go through the promulgation or the creation, and the public comment processes and the time periods to have these new rules take effect? And this is an example where, we normally have, the Constitution and we have rules that we follow. But then in times of great emergency or crises, sometimes we short circuit some of those. Again, it's just it's a balance we're trying to strike in our society. And so in this particular case, the FAA was able to kind of get these regulations through, kind of very, very quickly. And then, the farther we've gotten away from 9/11, the FAA, if they propose new rules, they go through the normal procedures. So if they're discussing should passengers be allowed to carry more than 5 ounces, through security onto a plane, they'll propose it and it gets argued, public comments, public hearings. Can you or I as passengers bring a nail file or nail clippers? Think of all the different things that, sometimes you're allowed to bring or not allowed to bring on an airplane. And, because we've kind of gone so long now without another attack, thankfully, the FAA will go through these normal procedures. Heaven forbid we have something else crazy that happen. You're going to see whatever agencies are involved. They're going to probably be able to fast track, some immediate regs or regulations. And then at some point when things settle down and get back to whatever normal is nowadays, then they go through the normal, you publish in the Federal Register, you provide the public comment period for 30, 60, 90 days or longer, and then you have public hearings. So it's a fascinating case involving the FAA, but again, it shows you, we're trying to strike a balance here. Government, as I tried to kind of allude in our previous chapters where we've talked about the Constitution, nothing is ever going to be perfect, but we're trying to balance, competing and conflicting interests here. And, we want to be pro-business, but we also want to protect, consumers and make sure that they're not, being tricked or harmed by products and services that are being sold to them. We want to try and protect the environment so that future generations can enjoy, what we currently enjoy on this planet. When you think of, beaches and mountains, streams, being able to live on this planet in a habitable way. So it's a tall order of what we expect of government to do for us. But nonetheless, this is an example of how we're trying to strike that balance. The last slide that I have for this chapter, I ask, what is the Federal Register? What role does it play in rulemaking? And then what is the difference between the Federal Register and the Code of Federal Regulations? So just remember, if we're talking about the Federal Register, that's the governmental publication that notifies the world that an agency is considering a new rule. So again, it could be any agency, FAA, the FTC, the SEC, the EPA, all the different, all the different agencies that exist. They'll be like, this is an idea we have for a new regulation, or maybe to tweak an existing regulation. That's the Federal Register. The Code of Federal Regulations, those are proposals that were initially in the Federal Register that went through the public comment period, that went through the hearing process, and that actually were passed. And now they are officially federal regulations. And so they have the effect of law, just as if it were a bill that was argued and debated in Congress, in the House and Senate, and passed, and the president signed it into law. It's treated as the same. It's just a different area of where we get law from. So that's the difference between the Federal Register and the Code of Federal Regulations. I hope this helped improve your understanding of administrative agencies, how they act as mini governments, in that they have a legislative, an executive, and a judicial component to them, and how they actually go about, the rulemaking process, as well as how the courts can intervene and provide judicial review. That's the better phrase to use. They provide judicial review for what agencies are doing. And so understand, you have to exhaust your remedies first within an agency. And if you still are unhappy, then you can go into a traditional courtroom. But if you have any questions, please reach out to me anytime. But have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will be chatting with you in future chapters. Thank you.